Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we are going to begin with Facebook, and particularly one of Facebook's planning managers actually coming out and saying that he thinks that Zuckerberg is essentially a king. But the question I wanted to ask actually is whether Facebook, and Zuckerberg more specifically, is king. You see, the way this guy, and it's worth it to mention, this is a Project Veritas leak that it has come out with this planning manager talking about what he feels about Zuckerberg and Facebook, and I'm not necessarily of the opinion that everything he says here is somehow more legitimate because he said it in a private context, because it's fairly clear this guy is a fairly hardcore lefty, other than being maybe a particularly more honest one, at least in private. But on top of that, it seems to me that he's promoting things like a breakup of Facebook, with its many subsidiaries being broken up into separate companies. He is promoting this thing. This never works, at least not when it comes to actually lessening corporate power. What it inevitably does is it ends up creating a corporate hegemony more often than not. There's very few times, at least that I've seen, where a company has been broken up and then that company has somehow withered away or somehow become less powerful. Generally, it seems to me that it becomes more powerful and more entrenched within the bureaucratic process. And that belies the true nature of Facebook's power. You see, Facebook doesn't have any power over anyone necessarily, but if it does have any power, and it has gained any power, it has gained that power through nothing but the regulation and corporate subsidies that it has gotten from the federal government. In a sense, they are simply an extension of the US government, and that is the truth of most tech companies. As I've mentioned many times before, all of these places have gotten hundreds of millions of dollars, with the biggest one being $600 million to Google, and that was back in 2015. Imagine what it is at now, because these sorts of corporate subsidies have not stopped, have not abated in the meantime. Maybe, I don't know exactly what they would be at now, but certainly they are still getting kickbacks in many different ways from the federal government, and that is the truth. They are not private entities. They are arms of the state. And once you understand that, and you understand everything that is going on, it becomes clear that Zuckerberg isn't king, because he has no power over anyone regardless. It is rather the government that makes them look like kings. And this is what the project manager here seems to miss out on. And there have been other things occurring within the Facebook era, with some of them being Facebook promoting an algorithm which promotes quote-unquote authoritative sources whenever something like a vaccine is talked about. Of course, how they define authoritative sources is perfectly arbitrary, because the truth is about authority and what authoritative sources is that something is an authoritative source exactly because it is promoted by the platform which it is posted on. Something like the CDC, well, maybe not something like the CDC, but something like the New York Times, some press organization, or wherever else they're going to be promoting as authoritative sources on any given subject, are only going to be authoritative on Facebook because it is promoted by Facebook. It is exactly that promotion which makes them an authority on the subject, because any authority cannot be gotten through purely natural means. And in that case, they would simply be a trusted source. But an authoritative source is something a bit different. It is the sort of public form of trust, whereas trust can be an individual assessment where any individual can go to any particular source and determine whether they believe and trust the source to give them information accurately. And the difference between that and between an authoritative sources, where the public entity, in this case being Facebook, or it could be any specific public entity, including the federal government itself and not any of its front groups, promoting the same. It's something like the CDC comes to mind when you think of something like that. That would be an authority on the subject, but they are not necessarily trustworthy because it was not gotten through an individual circumstance. You have to look into the particulars. You need to see the methodology and that sort of stuff. And that's what you need to do under all of these circumstances. Because are Facebook sources inherently wrong and are the people's sources inherently right? Of course not. That's not how this works. You have to look in them at the particulars. Because, of course, the devil's in the details. It's quite a good saying. Because many people will completely miss the methodology by which any given piece of information is culled. And as I've mentioned many times before, the methodology is quite literally the most important part of determining the efficacy of any given piece of information. Once you have ascertained whether the methodology is correct and done well, or whether it is inaccurate or somehow pseudoscientific in the case of something like models, which I have completely gone off on multiple occasions. Once you have ascertained that, you can ascertain whether the information is even useful to the discussion at hand. And once you have determined that, you have a much more clear understanding of the world and politics and how that all stands. It's a very good thing. But Facebook, to get back to the main subject, is Facebook king? No. No, of course not. You have not lost your free will. You have not lost any ability to actually search out any of what we were just talking about just because Facebook started approaching authoritative sources and started putting them out there. You didn't lose any of that. All you did, potentially, depending on how strict they get with it, is you lost one potential avenue of fact-checking a particular source, that being through Facebook posts, which can link to other things and show you other things that maybe go against the more traditional authoritative narrative. Once you get past that point, you should understand that this is only, to put it in programming terms, the highest level of communication. You can go down one level more. You can go to your friends. You can go to your community. You can go into more private chat rooms. You can go even one level deeper than that and actually do in-person communication with other people. You can go to places where you can discuss these sorts of topics and find the information that everyone else around you has and find it through those means. Those means are not lost to you because you can't go onto Twitter or Facebook and post it out publicly for the rest of the world, or at least the world that is on Twitter or Facebook, to see. You have not lost that. And I think it's important to mention that because when we talk about Facebook or Twitter or just generally big tech censorship, there are a lot of problems that occur because of such. I'm not denying those, nor am I downplaying them. I am simply attempting to put it into perspective that Facebook and Twitter have only existed for around 15 or so years, all right? And before that point, before the point of social media or the internet, there were many ways of disseminating not just traditional forms of information through something like a magazine or a radio show or TV or whatnot, but even alternative forms of information, using more informal methods that don't have to go through the institutions. This is not the only way to communicate, and we have not lost the ability to do so in a more traditional fashion. We shouldn't give up on that either, because these companies are only at the places they are now as of around 10 years ago, at best. And, if you want to go latest back. You think we can't rebuild the infrastructure from there? You think that it is impossible for us to even attempt such for all the black pillars in the back? Of course we can. Facebook is not king. Zuckerberg is not king. Alright? If he is, he has a false crown. One that is only partially appointed to him through the federal government, which has been subsidizing him all the way through. And once those are gone, once everything that is supporting them incorrectly from the top, going down, is gone, then they will truly be on a level playing field. Then places like Minds and other places which do not systematically alienate their users will have a even playing ground with the rest of these companies. Really, all you have to do is defund them on the governmental level, and that's not going to be accomplished through regulation. So do not attempt to do so. It is an utter absurdity to even try such a foolish endeavor. Moving on, though, and that was a pretty long rant that we had there, almost 10 minutes. We have a lie coming out of WAPO, and they have actually retracted this story, where they were talking about a particular phone conversation Donald Trump was having with some Georgia officials. They claimed, of course, that he was telling them to find the fraud, you'll be a hero, as if he was attempting to make them invent voter fraud and attempt to make it look as though the election was stolen, when in fact it was not, and this was a whole conspiracy. Well, it's come out as of recent, because of audio leaks that we actually hear from Donald Trump and this conversation, that this was utterly untrue and that their anonymous sources were completely off the mark. Rather, Donald Trump was saying something more along the lines of this. They were saying, or Trump was saying, that that he was urging them to rather scrutinize the ballots, scrutinize them with an honest eye, and he insisted that they would probably find dishonesty there. And that is quite a different thing from telling them to find fraud. While it is true that this is not technically a lie, as finding the fraud and scrutinizing the ballots to search for fraud are not exactly disparate topics, it is a lie because of how it is portrayed. It is a lie because WAPO was portraying it as Donald Trump wants them to invent fraud, when it's clear from his actual speaking that he wanted them to scrutinize it and determine whether there was fraud in the first place, which, by the way, up till this point has still not occurred, though there actually have been updates on this point where Georgia is potentially going to open up some of these records, which is a very good thing. And it's funny, to add on to this, to Washington Post lies, there are many other outlets that did the exact same thing and had quote-unquote anonymous sources confirming pretty much the exact same thing that WAPO was telling them. And there has to be something which is asked at this point. Are all of these huge media organizations using the exact same sources to confirm the same story? Are all of them taking the exact same anonymous account and saying, okay, I can take this anonymous account and then square it with this other story based on an anonymous account, and they line up pretty well? Probably true. Let's put it out there. Maybe they were a bit too close, though. Maybe they were a bit too exactly the same, down to maybe the very letter. Because what might end up being the case is that this story was confirmed by multiple anonymous sources from different media outlets, but they were all using, fundamentally, the exact same anonymous source. And because they aren't talking to each other, at least not as much as they clearly should be, and wouldn't ascertain what the anonymous source was on their end, they were all assuming they were using different anonymous sources when they were in fact using the same thing. That is the sort of media malfeasance that you should be outraged about. This is the sort of thing that prevents a lot of people from understanding much of what's going on in the political space. When everything is being funneled through one singular character, as it was in this story, at least presumably, what you end up getting is many completely inaccurate articles being pushed as fact. And once they get pushed as fact, because of the quote-unquote authoritative sources, as we've already talked about, it has been pushed in media, in social media, not just traditional media. And what this has caused, in all likelihood, is not anything good for the traditional media or social media. Having lots of corrections is not good for the Washington Post. Eventually, people are going to catch on to such and will start leaving these places behind and stop trusting them. People will stop trusting the Facebook authoritative sources when they start being wrong about literally everything. When it comes out that someone like me was much more close to on the mark on something like, say, masks, that anyone else was, claiming things like 45% reduction rates, when in fact it was around about 1%, according to the only population actual data-driven study ever done in the past quite a few years at least. When the only one that is there supports my position and no one else's in terms of the traditional media, that will make people move away from all this sort of stuff. And that's why you shouldn't be so black belt. And this is sort of the theme that we're going along with for this episode. You really shouldn't be black belt, because even throughout all of this, even throughout all of these problems, there are always going to be people and lots of different organizations that will not be swayed. There will be lots of people who will come to the side of reality, to the side of at least mere sanity, rather than this utter insanity that has been occurring on the left. Eventually that will happen. And I wanted to ask you, actually, when do you think this all goes away? When do you think the SJWs blow over? If you think they will at all. Do you think that the black pillars are right? That it's simply an uphill battle that will never be won? Or do you believe, as I do, that there is a chance, and that we were simply at the beginning of the war here, not the end? And that's not what 2020 was. Do you believe like me, or do you believe like the black pillars? Put it down in the comments section. I want to see what you guys think about it. Moving on, though, to our third story of the day, actually, not our last. We still have one more after this. The White House has reached out to North Korea and has received no response. Now, this is a pretty big slap in the face. Biden's foreign policy has already been utterly awful, to put it mildly at best. Really, he does deserve the title of Resident Biden, because he has been doing nothing but terrible things. And we can talk about the Syria strikes, we can talk about the border crisis, and now with him being flubbed by a guy out of North Korea, probably because he thinks, Kim Jong-Un, I mean, probably thinks that he's not going to get any blowback from this. Biden is quite the weak president, and it's kind of strange to say that when it seems like he's gearing up for Middle Eastern conflict. However, it is not so much that he is totally raring and ready to go for conflict, or is cowering away in the background, away from all conflict that could possibly be the case. It's more that he has the answers exactly wrong on which one he should act like, depending on the region of the world. Because when we're talking about the Asiatic regions of China or North Korea, you should be more gung-ho about trying to actually deal with them in a more military style. That's actually fairly justified in my book. I feel as though moving into China, being more hostile with China, being more hostile with a place like North Korea, will work long term, but to a place like the Middle East where it is truly chaos, and there are many problems which are occurring there, and some of which do actually deserve some level of military action, you need a more deft touch, because there are people in the region who are willing to deal with this sort of stuff on a more direct level. Israel exists, and the Abraham Accords are quite a big step in that area. Donald Trump's foreign policy was uniquely effective. Out of all of the presidencies, certainly in my lifetime, though that doesn't include very much, but even going back multiple decades before I was born, quite the effective president Donald Trump is. It turns out that when you do the, well, essentially Theodore Roosevelt style of foreign policy, speak in a soft tone and walk around with a big stick, which is essentially how Donald Trump did it, except he spoke in a less soft tone than I think Teddy Roosevelt might have. It turns out it worked fairly well and ended up in a lot of peace and a lot of progress, particularly in this, relevant to this story, on the North Korean front. He was able to get North Korea to actually talk with South Korea, and was able to be the first president to walk across the non-militarized zone without an escort. That is insane. That is a measured difference between any past president. And it caused a lot of very good things to happen. And it caused China to also back off on a lot of what they were trying to do. Of course, they've gone back on that, but that likely has to do with Biden being in office currently. Because they don't believe that he's going to be doing anything nearly to the extent that Trump was. Because the globalists, while I will say they are not directly enemies with China, nor are they directly allies either, they don't care about the Asiatic regions over there. They don't care enough to actually try and act militarily against those sorts of countries, and they aren't going to do so unless pushed to it through some extreme. Perhaps if China were to invade Taiwan, for instance, maybe there would be some measured response in terms of military. But most of the time, these globalists, people like the World Economic Forum, many of the people in the Biden administration who are actually controlling President Biden rather than, President Biden himself, when you're talking about those people, they're not directly allies, nor are they enemies with them. And that is important to understand. And it's something that I didn't quite grasp until a few weeks in, where I started realizing there was a bit of a disparity between how President Biden himself would speak about China, defending the Uyghur Muslim genocide, and all of those sorts of things that have been terrible in terms of rhetoric from Biden, and the difference between that and the actual response from the government. The government has been ambivalent at best to China, even under the Biden administration. And this is something you have to accept. They have done certain things that are, at least can be perceived as, being against China. Because the globalist World Economic Forum guys, once again, are not allies of China, nor are they enemies of China. Though President Biden clearly, at least partially, is an ally of China, mostly because he's kind of in their pocket. So you have this kind of strange two-tiered system where Beijing Biden and President Biden is Beijing Biden. All right, he is clearly in the pocket of China and is defending them way too much. But then you have the administration, which acts mostly ambivalent and is sometimes even somewhat hostile to them. It's quite a strange thing. But it shows that the administration is not necessarily going to act militarily against China, certainly not going to do anything like a trade war against them like Trump would do. And that's an important distinction there, because there needs to be a whole lot more action against China, though certainly their economy has a more than 0% chance of imploding on its own, which I have spoke to that possibility multiple times in the past, and I've spoken to how COVID almost completely wrecked them already, and they're still not in great shape, despite what their numbers will tell you. Anyone who believes those numbers, by the way, yeah, you're all idiots. All of you. Any numbers coming out of China cannot be trusted. None of them can. Because they're all designed to make China look as good as possible. I don't know why I need to explain that anymore. They're a communist country. That's how that works. All right. Moving on to our last story. The New Jersey governor has warned patients will was warned, not has warned. Patients will die due to nursing home policy, and this is back last March, a full year before all of this sort of stuff was coming out about how there are so many cover-ups happening in Cuomo, and there's so much nonsense that was occurring on. Before most of this policy was properly implemented even, they were being warned that this policy would be disastrous. This was already what was happening. And anyone with eyes, once again, just to go back to that saying, anyone with eyes could have seen this coming. You don't need a medical degree. You don't need to know anything other than that diseases are bad for old people to know that if you put sick people in an old folks home where they're going to be mingling with all sorts of old people, that there's gonna be problems. You didn't need a master's degree in frickin' epidemiology to realize that. But of course, no one talked about this at the time. Almost no one. Certainly some out of ignorance, some not knowing that this policy even existed at the time, as it was kind of an undercover policy over all of the lockdowns, 15 days to slow the spread and such, which, by the way, 1 year anniversary of that is coming up pretty soon here. And that's, man, where did that go? I wish that it was 15 days to slow the spread at this point. But of course, it should have been, screw you, no lockdowns. That's what should have been. That's what it should have been. But I just wanted to bring that to you guys' attention, because that is an important thing to make known. That these people were warned. They knew it was going to be a problem. They aren't stupid. They aren't dumb. All right? They didn't even need medical experts to warn them of this. I'm sure they knew this would be a problem. I'm sure they knew. But they did it anyway. And that's an important thing to understand, that places like New Jersey, which I believe had it, New York, and Michigan certainly, and I think a few other states even, that these people still did it after being warned. And after, having eyes and being able to see that it would be a problem before it even happened. That is important to know. And that's where our stories for the day end. And if you like that video, do in fact subscribe down below. And if you go a bit deeper past the sources and all that sort of stuff, which, by the way, I do suggest you check out, and do fact check me on all this sort of stuff if you have any problems with how I portrayed the sources or talked about them, or the sources themselves, do put them down in the comment section or contact me somehow. I would appreciate it. But even below that, we have lots of links down in the description with very good places to go and look if you're on YouTube and you have a masochism problem, which you'd have to be if you're on YouTube at this point watching small, independent political commentators like me. If you are, do go look down. I have many great video websites. BitChute's the most consistent one, by the way. All my videos, in fact, go up on BitChute first. So if you wanted to see my videos as quickly as possible, that's where you need to go. And beyond that even, you also have places where I put my thoughts or put out links to my videos wherever they are that day. And that would be Parler, Gab, and Minds. And Minds is where I put most of my thoughts. So if you wanted to check out that stuff, then there's where you're going to find it. And, I'm Cal Kidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.